All right, I think we are ready to start. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jean-Michel, and I am the founder and director of iDebate Rwanda. First of all, I think we are ready. I'm very excited to welcome each one of you to this event. This is an event that we have been preparing for a few weeks, and can't wait to see how this event unfolds. And of course, as tradition goes, I'd like to begin by first introducing our guests, and I'd like to give the floor to Coach Medina to speak on behalf of his team and then welcome his team. And but before we do that, I'd like to say that I met Coach Medina about 7 years ago when iDebate Rwanda was doing a tour of the US, and he spoke to us at Wiley College, and he spoke to us about what the team was doing. And then he was kind enough to actually have one of our students be on scholarship to attend Wiley College. It was one of the fastest application to university and admission to university. It all happened within the space of 2 weeks. And Winnie was recruited on the Wiley College team. And then she has gone on to do great things. She went to Tufts for her master's, and she really enjoyed her time at Wiley, and Coach Medina has welcomed us all these different years when we are in the US, and I'm excited that we finally get to do an event together. And so now, over to you, Coach Medina.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can see me. As Jean-Michel said, my name is Chris Medina. I am the founder of the National HBCU Speech and Debate Association. In addition, I'm the Director of Forensics at Prairie View A&M University, and formerly the Director of Forensics of the Great Debaters. I want to welcome everybody and thank you for doing this. We've had so many people who have been so excited about this event. First thing I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce and thank our Assistant Director of Forensics, Mr. Jeremy Kaufman, for all of his hard work. And then I'd also like to introduce our two debaters. First is Chiamaka Okoye, who is a biology major and is a senior, graduating senior. I've been trying to convince her to stay, but she won't. And but she's been a fantastic debater. And her partner is Maya McFarland, who is a junior, a political science major. Both Maya and Chia have, in the last few weeks, actually won 5 championship titles, 4 HBCU national titles, and the International Forensics Association championship title. And so we're really excited to have this discussion and this debate. And I'd also like to introduce our judge, who is, it's an honor to have Mr. Bob Latan, who is going to be adjudicating. Mr. Latan is actually the author of a book that's recently been released by the Brookings Institute called Resolved: Debate Can Change Education and Save Our Democracy. He is a former debater himself and a good friend. And so we thank you so much, Bob. Now, on to back to Jean-Michel.
Thank you very much. Of course, I'd like to thank all of you who are here, who are tuning in on YouTube. Right now, we are going to welcome Diakite Bangali. Diakite Bangali is the regional coordinator for iDebate Rwanda, and he is just going to do the welcoming remarks for iDebate.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Just as Jean-Michel said, my name is Diakite Bangali, the regional coordinator at iDebate. We're an NGO that uses debate to enhance critical thinking and public speaking skills in the youth of Rwanda. And around the region. We have a couple of programs that we have, and they're all centered around that. So we're glad to be here tonight. We're glad tonight, yeah, it's night here. And I would like to introduce the team from Rwanda. It's made of Akram and Ben, who are both current, one of them is a current student right now at one of the high schools we work with, and the other is one of our alumni. He's part of our alumni network. So we're so glad to be here, and we hope that this debate goes well, and we hope to doing greater things with you guys. We're glad to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bangali. And yeah, so I think with all the introduction done, I would like to begin, let this debate start. And I would like to give the floor to Robert Linton to take over and adjudicate this debate.
Thank you very much. I'm very privileged to be here. I don't have much to say, except I'm eager to start the debate, and I don't know who's starting first, but whoever is, I guess this has been prearranged. We're ready to
go. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, respectively. My name is Musingo Mugabe Benjamin, and I'll be arguing on the affirmative side. The debate today is this House regrets the global rise of the populist movement. Straight to topicality, the term populist movement is the most important term of this debate, which is the approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. And elite groups could be big corporations, institutions, businesses, the government itself, and so many more. Something else with the populist movement is that the populist movement basically shows one side against another, and that is it shows the government or the elite group against the what they like to call the real people or the pure people. And one we have to ask: is there indeed a global rise of a populist movement? And as we can see in Europe and the US itself, democracies that are considered mostly conservative, there has been a rise of populist movement. Therefore, we have a stand. We have a right to make this stance. Who are real people, even if they really exist, as the populists say? And one thing, our main argument is, one, populism brings about even more divisionism, brings about more hate crimes, brings about more racism and all that. And also populists can do significant damage to a democratic political culture, even if they don't even govern, as we have seen recently with the Capitol attacks in the United States. Now, John Werner Muller, in his paper, The Rise and Rise of Populism, he argues that, one, they always exclude at two levels. At the level of party politics, they present themselves as the only legitimate representatives of the people. Two, they also divide the people themselves by making that claim. Therefore, the populists, we do regret, in fact, the populist movement that is rising in the world today. The populist movement is about the will of the people, and that is what they claim. They claim that we do this for the people, the pure people, as they call them. And to regret this is actually the best thing we could do. We don't, condemn them. We regret that we even listened to them in the first place. Now, we argue that populism is not a democracy because populism goes against democracy, goes against most of the values of a democracy. Because A good example main opposers of the populist movement mainly give is, what if the elections ended up being a 51 to 49% vote? Won't there be still people that are not accounted for by democracy? But yes, even though that is the case, it is still democracy because that is the definition of democracy. To continue to quote from The Guardian, an international media group, in its original form, populism is an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt people, as I have gone on to say. The one problem with this is, as much as they argue this, they do not change the system. The people that argue that the system is corrupt and all that, they go into that same system and they bring in the ideas, yes, but they go into that same system, which therefore is what we could call something that's useless or meaningless. However, the populist movement also almost always fails, as you have seen in our arguments, from Hugo Chavez of Venezuela and recently Donald J. Trump of the United States. And with that, I think my time is up and I raise my case.
All right. As this is my first time speaking, I would like to thank everyone for being here today. It is an incredible privilege to be able to debate a team from across the world. And with that, I'm going to extend that blanket of thanks and give you a brief roadmap for my speech today. I'm going to first begin with some resolutional analysis, looking at the resolution and what it binds each side of the resolution to do. Then we'll be attacking the points made by the affirmative and then moving into the negatives off case. But first, for some resolutional analysis. As far as definitions, the breakdown of the populist movement being the ordinary people or the common people against a perceived elite group, we agree with that definition. However, the negative believes that there are other key terms in the resolution to define, and that being regret. So we're going to offer the definition for regret since the affirmative did not offer one, and that is to be very sorry for, according to Webster. And so a key observation of this resolution here today, Judge, is the fact that there needs to be a magnitude of taking into account. So when we think about regretting something globally as a house, it has to be to a certain degree. So the affirmative has the burden to prove that populism, the rise of the populist movement, and on a large magnitude has been bad, and it's something that we should regret. And in order to weigh today's round, we're going to offer a weighing mechanism of on balance. So looking at more often than not, populism is bad, then it is good, and therefore we should regret it, which once again means to feel very sorry for it. So first, getting into their first contention, they talk about how populism leads to division, and they give you all these bad things that populism leads to. However, that isn't in totality populism. What that actually is extremism. That's people taking their own viewpoint on this and turning it into something that at its core, it's not. And we'll get into that more in the negative off case. Their second contention, they talk about how populism damages democracy. However, inherently, populism is essential to democracy. You look on one hand, you see democracy, which is a system that is for the people and by the people. And on the other hand, you look at populism, which is a system that believes in power going to the people. So the two coincide. The two are necessary in order to have an effective democracy. It is important that you have the will of the people be observed. And in their subpoint, they get into more talking about how populism doesn't actually change the system and how populism always fails. However, if we look at populism once again at its core, which is taking a group of common people, of ordinary people, against an elitist system, we see that this isn't the case. It doesn't always fail. You look at great leaders such as Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, or Martin Luther King, and you see how they took a group of common people who were at the hands of an elitist oppressor, and they were able to lead and change civil rights and change the course of humanity for generations in a positive and a good way. So when we look at On Balance, which is our weighing mechanism of today's round, we see that populism can be good and isn't just all bad, and which is what the affirmative would have to prove, that the bad would outweigh the good. Now, moving into the negative off case, our first contention here is the fact that regret is not enough. So psychologist Margaret Fieldstead draws a key division in terms of the definition between regret and remorse. Regret is essentially just feeling bad about something, but it doesn't contain true empathy, right? Empathy of being able to understand the harm that a wrong has caused. On the other hand, remorse contains empathy. You are able to understand the damage that's been done. And because you are able to understand, you're able to actually do something about it, Fieldstead argues. And so we see in subpoint B here that remorse is what actually leads to change. It's what actually leads to action, by people feeling remorseful and not just regretful about the harms that have been done in the past. That's how we get to change. That's how we change the world on a global scale. You know, feeling bad about something is going to keep us in that situation. By continuing to cry over spilt milk instead of moving forward and actually cleaning up the mess, we'll actually be able to get change. And you can see this even when you look at the Holocaust and Germany post the Holocaust and the actions that they took. You know, they didn't just feel regretful that it happened, they felt remorseful. And because they felt remorseful, they actually put in place policies like reparations that led to change. Contention number 2 on the negative off case is the fact that inherently the ideal is not the issue. The issue is in fact the people. So once again, populism at its core is a group of common people against an elitist oppressor, or whoever they perceive to be an elitist oppressor. This can both be good and be bad. So let's look at somebody like Donald Trump, for instance, who is a populist leader, and see his common people were middle-class white Americans, and the ruling elite was the power in Washington. That innately is not a bad thing. The issue is that with extremism, Trump was able to divert the attention away from the power in Washington and financial and political corruption towards divert the attention away from that and move it more towards minorities, which is when it can become a problem. However, populist movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, in which you have the common people being African Americans who are suffering at the hands of the police elite that are oppressing and killing us, that they are able to say something positive and do something good with that because of who they define as the us versus them in the populist dynamic. So yes, while populism has the potential to be bad, it also has the potential to be good, because innately it is simply the people and power to the people. Issues derive when extremists use it. So the issue here that the affirmative is outlining is extremist populism and not actually populism itself. Populism itself innately is not bad. And then contention number 3, for the negative case, we'll see that exposure can actually be a good thing. By seeing populism in action, especially extremist populism in action, we as a globe are able to stand against it. So when we talked about Trump earlier, we see that Donald Trump is no longer the president of the United States, and those ideals are no longer winning in our policies solely because of the fact that he had a 4-year term. He was able to show us what those policies look like on a national scale. And because of that, people were able to see for themselves that this isn't something that works. You know, what Donald Trump did was go to poor white people and he told them, look, your jobs are endangered. The way you lived your life is in danger because of these perceived enemies as minorities. And because of that, he was able to take advantage of them. And it wasn't until people were able to see it under the light, see it exposed, that we were actually able to make difference and make change in electing a new leader. And that is why we have no choice, and urge you as well to stand in negation of today's resolution.
Chia, I believe Benjamin has a question.
Oh, I'm so sorry, I could not see you.
It's okay. Could you differentiate socialism and populism?
Excuse me, I did not quite hear you.
Could you differentiate socialism and populism?
I would say populism is more focused on the people. So you define the people, and it can be a variation of definitions against an elite. And then socialism is more about people in general. Like, and it's not targeting two sides against one another, versus populism is targeting two sides, an elite versus a common people. Socialism is more for everyone in general. That's what I would say.
Akram, are you ready?
Hello, everyone. Here. What? Here.
Akram, are you ready?
I think his connection is bad, so just use your audio if your connection is not strong enough.
Okay, so you guys are going to be sorry because the video connection was too low here at my place. But I'm going to start by being clear to some points I was able to note here for the precurrent speaker. She talked about the word regret. Regretting wasn't emotionally proof that it was clear. Yeah, I think I would agree with that, but that's how the motion is, and you try to give the meaning of it, as we also said, as we also gave the point of, as we also talked about populism as it's negative, on the negative side of it. So what I'm trying to be clear here is that here is that no matter how much you try, populism was never good since the 19s until now. It will never be good.
I think because of the connection, Ben, can you make the speech and then we'll probably do the other ones?
Okay. I'm sorry for that. I'll be going on with what he was trying to say. He was making an argument. He was making an argument about. Sorry, Akram, could you mute yourself? Okay. So he was making an argument about regret, and basically what he was trying to argue is that it's okay if regret and remorseful, they're two different things. It's okay. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this debate should be cancelled or should be thrown out, because regret, right now we could regret, and then the next stage could be being remorseful. It doesn't necessarily have to be that we can't regret, and we have to always be remorseful, because regret is useless. We can be regretful, then we can be remorseful. It doesn't necessarily mean that our definition of our terms was inherently wrong. They're going to talk about the magnitude of, which is basically like what is good about populism, what is bad about populism. The only good thing, as we said about populism, is that populism shows that yes, there is a problem. There is a problem with the elites, and that's a good problem. The only issue with that argument and with the populist movement that we have is that they do not solve this problem. They just show a problem, then base all the propaganda on people's emotions, and people feel emotional and vote for them, and then they do not actually bring change. We saw this with Donald J. Trump, saw this with Hugo Chavez. We are seeing it in many countries, and that is the problem. It is rising. Maybe if Mahatma Gandhi was a populist, and it was a good thing at that time. It happened, and it saved lives, and it reduced violence and all that. But what about now? The rising populism is far-right populism. There's two types of populism: the left and the right. And what is currently rising, which is what we're debating about, is the far-right or the nationalist populism. Then the nationalist populist movement. I'm sorry. And one thing it is bringing about is the crime rates. Crime rates in Venezuela have risen tremendously. Recently, we also saw the Capitol attacks in the United States, and that had never happened before, not even in the Civil War or anything like that, which shows how bad and how crucial, how bad the populist movement can be. Even if they do not necessarily take government, they can cause a lot of damage to democracy. And as I argued in the beginning, in the first speech, we talked about how in itself, it is not a democracy. It is just, opposition to a democracy, and it's in itself is not a democracy. Populism in its purest form is a good thing, but the rising populism, which is the right-wing populism, as we have been arguing, is a bad thing, and that is what we're basing all our arguments upon. Going back to our arguments, we talked about, how it's basically populism is about the elites are bad. That's the argument. The elites are bad. We are the pure people, and therefore I am your only leader. And that is the problem we have with populism. Is it shows that there is only one solution to that problem. There is only one solution, and for Venezuela it was Hugo Chavez. For the United States it was Donald J. Trump. And once they didn't vote for him, what happened? We all know. The populism movement is about the will of the people, yet it doesn't stand for the will of the people. It argues that it's for the will of the people, and yes, it doesn't stand. If it had stood for the will of the people, then, all these attacks and all these crimes, and what happened in Netherlands when the Prime Minister talked about Moroccans being ugly people, and them being immigrants, illegal immigrants, and therefore demeaning the entire country of Morocco. That's creating even more hate between countries, which shouldn't have happened in the first place. But since it's appealing to the emotions of some people, and those people will actually, because people will always be emotional. That's true. That's a fact. People will always be emotional, and therefore populists are using these emotions to take power and not bring change, and which they have been advocating for. One thing they bring about again is hate against media. If you look at any populist movement that is rising right now, it talks about media. We talk off my head. We could talk about Donald J. Trump and what he talked about. CNN news being all that. And him being backed by a certain media, and then the other media groups do not necessarily agree with them. And that is the issue. They bring hate about the people with media, and they also bring hate with other countries. You see what is currently happening in the US, the hate crimes rising between whites and blacks, whites and Asians, all that. It's basically based on a populist movement, a movement that appealed to people's emotions and talked about how, the middle income earning white person is being left out of what the big companies are doing and what the other ethnic groups are doing. And that is the issue we have with populism, is that. And going back to the topic, going back to the motion, we talked about this, this house regrets the global rise of the populist movement. Again, regret, as they're saying, is feeling very sorry. Now, we can correct that, which is feeling remorseful. But right now, what we're doing at this very moment in this very debate is regretting what the populist movement is doing by rising in the globe, in the world. With that, I raised our case. Thank you.
Let me get my 8 minutes on my clock. Just for a brief off-time roadmap, I will start off with some thank yous, and then I will start by refuting the points made by the affirmative. If there is any time, I will address the negations case for today's round. So with that, I will start my time now. I want to extend the warm blanket of thanks offered by my partner, as it is my first time speaking. It is such a pleasure to be here and debate with people across the world. This is a phenomenal opportunity. And I want to thank my opponents for laying out such a wonderful case that we will have such an educational debate. That being said, I will get into refuting some of the points made by my opponent in their last speech. Our opponent starts off by talking about how populism has a negative side, and no matter how much you try, populism is never good. However, my opponent does concede that Martin Luther King and Gandhi did provide positive change. These inherently are populist movements that provide power to the people and oppose the ruling elite. And these brought positive change, with Gandhi bringing down the British Raj, Martin Luther King helping to end segregation in the Jim Crow South. We can't just ignore these populist movements that have had monumental implications for positive change for people. So no matter how much you try, populism can never be good. I mean, I think we can all agree that Gandhi and Martin Luther King would beg to differ on that point. Continuing down, my opponent asserts that regret and remorse are different, but the debate should not be thrown out simply because of the definition. And the negation agrees to this. The debate definitely should not be thrown out. However, the negation is simply saying that regret itself is not enough. This house should not just simply regret, because when we see we have regret, it is not enough. And my opponent argues that perhaps we can regret first and then remorse, but this is not so, because the two are mutually exclusive. Allow me to elaborate. As my opponent started off in her first speech, she noted that regret has to do with you wishing you'd taken a different course of action, and it lacks empathy for the other side. We cannot first start off by lacking empathy and adding the empathy later. It doesn't work that way. We cannot regret and then remorse. Remorse actually leads to action. It is feeling guilt and shame for what has happened that leads to positive change in the future, which makes the two mutually exclusive, because this presence of guilt and shame that leads to action is absent in regret. And therefore we cannot regret before we remorse, because we need the presence of the guilt and shame in order to get the action that will lead to the positive change that the affirmative is actually calling for within their own case. Continuing down, my opponent asserts that populism shows the problem with the elite, which is good, but it does not solve for the problem. However, populist movements do bring change. I mean, arguably, Hugo Chavez has brought some change through his extremist populist movement in Venezuela. But again, to reaffirm what I've already said, we saw change with Gandhi and MLK in those populist movements. So we see that populism can solve for the problem. However, again, if we're talking about solvency and what's really going to bring change, regret isn't going to do that either. Furthermore, our opponents talk about how right populism can cause damage to democracy. But I want to point out that populism itself can be calling for the implementation of democracy. Case in point, the populist movement that is currently going on in Hong Kong and Taiwan, in which they are calling for a democracy and the removal of the authoritarian regime, which has no intention of listening to the people. If we are talking about a populist movement that wants to bring power to the common person and be down with the ruling elite, that's exactly what's happening in this Hong Kong and Taiwan populist movement. And they're calling for the implementation of a democracy. So we see this as a direct clash with the point that populism cannot or can cause damage to democracy, when populism can actually bring about and be calling for the implementation of democracy. Furthermore, I would like to point out that our opponent talks about populism does not stand for the will of all people. Again, perhaps this may be the case, but this is an extremist populism, not populism itself. And populism, as my partner so eloquently stated, is not inherently extremist, though extremists tend to use populist rhetoric. So the issue is not populism itself, which is trying to advocate for the common person. And that within itself is not wrong. Arguably, it's a wonderful idea and a powerful idea that people like Black Lives Matter are using to call for positive change. And furthermore, our opponent talks about how populism uses rhetoric that divides on the basis of things like migration and othering other people. However, I would like to point out that this doesn't necessarily happen in all populist movements. This happens in the rise of right-wing populist movements. And our opponent talks about, in today's round, we're talking about right-wing populism, but they define populism itself as an approach in which people who feel concerns are disregarded by the elite are now trying to have their voices heard by the common person or the pure people. We're not necessarily talking just about right-wing populism here. We're talking about populism in general. So like I said, the rhetoric that divides on the basis of migration or othering, like we saw under Donald Trump, is right-wing populism, which can be bad. However, we have ideas like Black Lives Matter, which are trying to point out the humanity within all of us, especially Black people who are a marginalized group within the United States. So it's not necessarily trying to create an other, as it is trying to point out that there is not an othering, that the humanity in Black people that is being ignored by the current ruling elite. Furthermore, our opponents talk about how populism brings about hate. But I want to point out that this is needed to air it out faster. And I want to hone in onto the third point of the negations off case, which is that this exposure is good. We need this to come out or else it will fester. Judge, let's look at the analogy of a wound. When you have a wound and it's sitting and there's bacteria under there, in order for you to heal the wound, you must pop it, and there's going to be pus and nasty things that come out. But we need to do this in order to heal the wound. Otherwise, it will fester and continue to get worse. So what I'm trying to say here is that the ideas of hate that are airing out under these right-wing populist movements will not go away just by getting rid of the right-wing populist movement. This hate against people continues whether or not we decide to address it or not. Therefore, it is a good thing that these right-wing populist movements are airing out these concerns so that we can see them in the light. Case in point, what has happened with Donald Trump and his extremist populist movement, where we saw all these people airing their concerns and their hate against minorities and Latinx populations. But when we as a country saw up close how bad this hate is, we vehemently turned away from it. Arguably, we have a long way to go. But because we saw it up close and we saw it opened out in the air, we were able to turn away from it. And that is why we need these things to be aired out. And furthermore, that is why regret itself is not enough. We need remorse, and that remorse is what leads to action. To illustrate this point, I would like to point out this idea of collective Schuld, which is an idea in Germany, which is about the collective guilt for the Holocaust. And it incorporates this idea that everyone should feel some sort of shame or guilt, regardless of what part you played, into what happened. And this is what has led to them vehemently making sure that they don't go back and revert to the ideas of Nazi Germany. If we do not feel remorseful for these ideas, then they will simply continue to re-emerge, and we receive no solvency for the issue, which the affirmative has agreed we want to solve the problem. So for all these reasons, I urge you to vote a ballot for the negation in today's round. Thank you.
All right, just a brief off-time thank you. Once again, I would like to thank everyone for being here today, the affirmative for setting up such a great round, and just to be in the same room talking about such a critical subject. And now I will move on into my last speech, and I will start my time now. So in this speech, I'm going to be giving you the reasons why you should be voting in negation of today's resolution. The first reason being that populism is not extremism. There is a key difference between the two that my partner and I have already elaborated through our other speeches. And what the affirmative has to get up here and do, and they should have done, is say that the global rise of populism is right-wing populism. And that's what they haven't done, Judge, and don't do the work for them. My partner and I bring up multiple instances of our current global rise in populism and how it isn't right-wing. We talk about Hong Kong, we talk about Taiwan, we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. We give you all these instances, both currently and in the past, with MLK and Gandhi, where we mentioned that how populism isn't always right-wing extremism. So we know that this global rise isn't right-wing, and therefore we can see that when we look back to our contention where we talk about the ideal itself isn't the issue, the negation wins on that point. It's the fact that inherently, what populism is the common people against the oppressive elites. And that is not a bad thing innately. And that's what the affirmative has not done in this round, is to prove to you that somehow that in and of itself is bad. But the second reason why you should be voting in favor of the negation is the fact that the affirmative's points no longer stand. So their first point, we see that extremism is actually what leads to division and not populism. It's people taking a hold of something and changing it from what it actually is, right? And then in their second point, they talk about how populism hurts democracy, but you've seen through the negative case today how populism is essential within a properly functioning democracy and how it can actually lead to help democracy. Our third reason why you should be voting in favor of the negation today is the fact that the negative case upholds our weighing mechanism of today's round, which is on balance, looking at what's going to do more good than harm on balance. And we see that they ended up dropping our inherency argument throughout this round. And we know that in debate, if you do not bring up, silence is concession. So if you don't address it, it means that you agree with it. So once again, the affirmative has already agreed that inherently populism isn't the issue. The actual issue is extremist populism, which is not what the negation is defending today. A subpoint B underneath the negation's class upholding the weighing mechanism better is the fact that regret and remorse are not the same thing. Regret is not sufficient enough to guarantee remorse. So even though the affirmative may tell you, sure, we can regret now and later we can be remorseful, that isn't how the real world works. That isn't how life proceeds. And we have to look at everything in debate, not as a vacuum in today's round, but look at what actually happens in real life. And we see that regret does not lead to remorse. And what we truly need is remorse. And that is what the negative is calling for. We're calling for us to not only feel bad, but to do something about it, to have the understanding, the empathy to actually create change and do something. At some point C, underneath the negatives class upholding the weighing mechanism better, is we see that exposure can be good. This goes mainly uncontested in today's round when they talk about how we realize that exposure, and by us being able to see it, that's how we're able to take those things down, as my partner stated. And our fourth reason why you should be voting in favor of the negation today is the fact that the negation gives you, Judge, and our audience today the opportunity to do more. The opportunity to move past just feeling bad about something into action. We as a world are called to do better. And in order to do better, we must do more than just regret. So I urge you today to vote in favor of the negation.
Thank you. Back for the reply speech. I'm sorry I'm doing every single speech. Our argument as the affirmative side was basically that we should be regretting right now. We have the time to regret. we're not being rushed by anything. We have the time to regret. And our argument for that was, why not allow some emotions, and why suppress some emotions and allow other emotions, and allow actions, right? That was their argument in their last speech, by the way, which was that some emotions should be suppressed, and we should act on other things and suppress some emotions because they were time wasting and all that. But we can argue that emotions are needed. They are very necessary for human beings, which is why we need to regret it right now. They talked about populism not being extremism, yet again, they talked about, we argued that what they're basically talking about is socialism, not populism, because populism in itself has one legitimate leader, one solution to the problem that they're bringing about. They bring about hate crime, they bring about media. What they're talking about is socialism, on the other hand, which is advocating for change by the people. That is their argument on their side. What we're arguing is that populism is not that. Populism is indeed, yes, you are going against the elite, that is one thing, but there are other parts of populism, which is what makes it ugly. You have one legitimate leader, and you're going against the media, and you're advocating for hate crimes and all that, which is why we're advocating for the regret of this populist movement. And again, we talked about the rise of the populist movement, and we argued that the rise of populist movement is not any other. It is the right-wing populism. And I argued that in the very first speech that I had. We argued that yes, there are many types of populism, but the rising populism is not any other. It is the right-wing populism. And they talked about Hong Kong and Black Lives Matter in the very last speech, and as hard as that is to rebut, I think this argument shouldn't stand simply because these are not populist movements. We can argue that these are socialist movements. They're advocating for the good of the people. They're going against the elite. Yes, that is one part of populist, but it does not necessarily mean that you become populist once you advocate for change, because populism has other factors, and one of them is, one single leader, one legitimate leader, as we had seen for Donald Trump. Once you hadn't voted for him, then capital attacks and all that. And they talked about hate crimes. They argued that hate crimes are an exposure for what they actually feel, what is actually happening, and that is a good point. Except they're not turning back; it is staying the same. That's the problem with the populist movement. They're only arguing that they are putting it out there, but there's no turning back. As a matter of fact, it's only increasing, which is what we're seeing with the Asian Americans, with all the hate crimes and the shootings that are happening. It is basically because of this. It's basically because of the populist movement. They are arguing that it's exposure, but it is really not. It's just it's not changing anything. It's as a matter of fact, is only increasing. One last thing we argued was that they are going against the media, which is a very valid point that they did not tackle at all. Therefore, we win this debate based on three main arguments. One, that what team opposition was advocating for was feeling remorseful for a socialist movement, and what we were talking about was the rise of a populist movement that is right-wing inherently. Talked about hate crimes increasing, and what they talked about was an argued exposure that these hate crimes do exist, as a matter of fact. But what we argued was, yes, they do exist, but they're staying the same. The populist movement is not doing anything about it, and in addition to that, they're only increasing. And it talked about them going against the media, which only corrupts people even more. Thank you, Aris, our case.
Okay. So I assume it's my turn to weigh in on this debate. Is that right, Chris?
You are correct, sir.
Okay, so I'm going to I'm going to cheat as a judge because I'm not going to declare a winner only because Rwanda was disadvantaged. They couldn't have two parties, two members. And so I thought we're going to talk about this as an excellent discussion. And I thought everyone did a great job. I particularly want to commend, I think all the expositions were very, very good. Now, let me get to the substance. So this debate about populism really all rests on the definition. All right. So if you define populism in a way that is just bad, it's hard to debate, right? Unless unless the negative wants to say that the narrow definition of just bad populism is too narrow, in which case, if the negative argues that, they're going to have to find a way to distinguish their populism from just ordinary democracy. All right. So, for example, in my lifetime, I'm almost 71. I think virtually every presidential campaign in the United States has been conducted by someone claiming that special interests in Washington or special interests in the country are somehow, against the will of the people. I mean, this has happened every election. And so if you define populism as to say, well, it's the will of the people versus against the elite, that would basically encompass every single election probably in every country. It would empty the word of the meat. I mean, it would empty the term populism of any meaning if that's what happens all the time. So in the negative, what you tried to say is, well, there are some good forms of populism. Witness Hong Kong, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and they were all examples of essentially, as you said, people rising up against an elite. How do you distinguish that from ordinary democracy? And then how do you distinguish that from extremism? The people that oppose them would accuse these people of extremist activity. So one thing that, at least from the negative side, I didn't get a definition of is what you would have meant by extremism. Because essentially extremism for you is a default word for bad, all right? But you didn't get into a definition. Now, let me go back to Rwanda. So Benjamin, you made the crucial point, not in your opening speech, but in your second affirmative speech. Of course, this isn't your fault. You didn't have a partner, but you defined populism in a way that is really bad. And you said populism is just different from just ordinary people against the elite. You defined it as, which I think is correct, as a movement that is led by one person who claims he or she has all the answers. All right, that was Donald Trump. He ran and said, I have all the answers, so trust me, no matter what I say, just follow me. That's one characteristic. And the second thing you pointed out is that populism, which is bad, inherently, you argued, raises an us against them, mentality. And when you divide the world that way, which very much is characteristic of not only what happened with Trump, but also other populists around the world, almost by definition, that's bad. Now, I will tell you where that definition comes from. There is a German political scientist who wrote a book, which I just checked on Amazon to make sure that I had the title right, which is called What is Populism? And it's by Jan Werner Müller. All right. I think it's one of the definitive political science books. And he uses the definition, Benjamin, that you used in the second affirmative, which is it's only me and it's us against them. You should have put that, the negative was right. You should have started a debate with that. You should have defined the populism that way at the very beginning and said that those kind of campaigns typically are right-wing, not always, because, when Russia was run by, a communist, and even today, with Putin, you could argue that they're populists. All right. Putin would say he's the only guy that can do anything in Russia. All right. And when Stalin was running Russia, he was saying, look, it's only me. So bad populism doesn't always have to be right wing. It can be completely left wing or communist or autocratic, because ultimately, if you define populism as basically embodied in somebody who says, I'm the only person who can run the country, that's autocracy. That's not democracy. And by definition, that's bad. If you had just started the debate with that proposition, it would have put the negative in a very difficult position. All right. Because the negative would have said, yeah, you've defined it in such a way that you can only win. There's no point in debating it because it's obviously bad. So the negative would have had to come back and said, no, your definition is too narrow. It means, you know, something broader. You would have introduced the good populace, and then it would have been the burden on the negative to say, well, what's extremism? You know, to distinguish the Hong Kong example and the Martin Luther King and the Gandhi example from extremism. You were never forced to do that because the affirmative never forced you to do that. So what I'm saying is each side made mistakes. Each side made very good arguments. And it was also a very illuminating discussion, I hope, for everybody in the audience. And congratulations on a great job.
Thank you, Robert, thank you for your remarks, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Very excited that we're able to have you on. And so this marks the end of our debate. And I'd like to give Coach Medina the last few words. But on my side, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. And I'd like to thank Prarie View for agreeing to do this debate with us. I'd like to thank the debaters. This was really interesting. And the great thing about doing things online is we have a resource that we can now share with more students when teaching them about debates. And I can't thank you all enough and just tell you how excited we are for building this relationship. And yeah, so over to you, Coach Medina.
Everyone, thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much for doing this. You know, Jean-Michel and I have been wanting to get our teams together to have a debate for many years. And so, you know, it finally became a reality. You know, Rwanda has a very special place in my heart. You know, with Winnie having been on our team, you know, we've been able to have so many discussions about Rwanda and try to help to further, you know, Rwanda in debate. But, you know, it's more important than that. I thank everyone for coming, because the ability to come together and have discussions on relevant world issues is so important within our society. And the fact that we can do it with folks from across the world means so much, because now we are able to have these discussions in a calm and rational manner, and we can discuss the problems and hopefully as a collective come to solutions. So thank you all very much. I do appreciate everyone for being here.
Thank you. Robert, if you're okay, can I give you just 2 minutes to talk about your latest book for our audience? Because I think they would really enjoy to hear about your latest book.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was very nice of you. So I have a book out called Resolved, How Debate Can Revolutionize Education and Save Our Democracy. And briefly, the idea is not just to use competitive debate as a way of educating kids at all levels, but introduce debate into the classroom in every subject. And I talk about it both in middle school and high school, and even in college, as Chris has great experience with. And the idea is to, whatever the subject, pick a claim that comes out of the material that you're reading, and then have the students debate, split them up into small groups where they can debate both the pro and the con of a claim, and have the students in effect teach each other through debate. And I find, and I spotlight some experiments in both Boston and Chicago in the United States about how the students who are doing that have more engagement with education. They have more fun. They tend to retain more from what they learn, because when you're forced to speak something and actually prepare for something, as you see for all the debaters today who participated, they were very prepared. They obviously did a lot of homework. Well, when you do that and are forced to do that in your classroom, you're inevitably going to remember a lot more than just having a teacher lecture to you, write your notes down, and then regurgitate the material on the test, and then you'll forget it the next time. I guarantee you, if you have to do this repeatedly and have to constantly prepare and speak and try to convince the other side of a proposition, you'll learn more, you'll learn civility, you'll learn what it means to be a citizen of a democracy, you'll be a better worker when you go to work, and you'll have confidence when you speak. So that's what the book is about, and I encourage you. You can buy it on Amazon or buy it through the Brookings Institution and enjoy it. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bob. And I just noticed that we have Dr. Benvoth here. And though we are at the end of our events, we're having an event with Dr. Ben in about 2 weeks. And since you're here, would you mind just sharing with the audience just like a quick 2 minutes about the book that we'll launch, and then we'll invite them, we'll send out an invitation for anyone who'd like to attend.
Absolutely, Jean-Michel. Thank you so much. And I'm honored to speak after Bob there. And I loved hearing what he had to say. It's funny that I came right after Bob because I was late to this because I was actually teaching. We have a gaming curriculum here at SMU, and the professors in gaming software want to have their classes debate in order to better learn like software instruction and things like that. So exactly what Bob's saying. And I do highly recommend his book. I just read it. I just ordered it myself, and I've been reading everything he writes. He's spot on. So I'm so glad that Bob's here with us today. And I'm sorry I missed y'all's debate because I was doing this instruction. Yeah, so in a couple weeks, I will be meeting with y'all to talk about this great new book that has come out that I've worked with Jean-Michel on. It's called Debate as Global Pedagogy, Rwanda Rising. And honestly, it really spotlights the incredible work that Jean-Michel and a lot of you all have done in Rwanda through debate. And it offers the debate programming that's gone on for 7 or 8 years in Rwanda as something that's a valuable global model. And literally like what Bob's talking about, we can actually see it worldwide. And the book gets into some, I think, really interesting things about how, for example, American civil rights leaders were consistently trained in argumentation and debate. People like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, but also people you may not have heard of, like James Farmer Jr. and Medgar Evers and James Meredith. Debate was absolutely imperative to the success of one of the most famous social movements in the United States, the American Civil Rights Movement, very well known globally. But the book details not only obviously the suffering of the people in Rwanda and the genocide against the Tutsis, but also how debate plays a special role both in the prevention and the amelioration of genocide after effects. And so, and Jean-Michel was indispensable in writing like chapter 7 and actually some other parts of the book as well. So I hope you will be willing to join me later in April for a further conversation on the details of that. We've got some things about HBCU debate in the United States, Chris Medina, and so many incredible people kind of contributed to making this book. And it is available. I'm sorry that it does kind of have an academic pricing to it. That's kind of pricey. If you have some special problems with that, I can probably help you work around that. But Lexington Books is publishing that. So hope you'll join us. Thanks, Jean-Michel, for letting me make that plug.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Ben. We look forward to the event. Thank you to all the debaters. I would say have a nice day where you are. And here it's a good night because it's almost 9 p.m. So thank you all and have a great evening and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.